Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2013 Advanced. In this section we're going to look at surface charts. And these are charts that are probably pretty much underused, although there are a couple of difficulties with surface charts that I'll talk to you about during this section. But from the point of view of presenting certain types of data, I do think that surface charts can be very useful. Now when we're plotting a surface chart, the reason we're doing it is to show the relationship between three variables. And the three variables may be some sort of physical measurements. So for instance, I've seen surface charts which have plotted temperature against latitude and season or month. And a surface chart with those three variables would give you a visual impression of how temperature varies the farther away you are from the equator and according to the time of year. But you can use a surface chart pretty much for any situation where primarily you're plotting one dependent variable against two independent variables. Now what I've decided to do in this section is to do things in a very different way to usual. Rather than give you some actual physical measurements, I've decided that we're going to use a surface chart to plot a mathematical function. Now I've got values of one independent variable x up here going from 0 to 10, and I've got values of another independent variable here, y, going from 0 to 100. Now the y variable goes in steps of 10 from 0 to 100. And then the z variable, so the values in these cells, are determined by a mathematical function. Now I could in fact have put any mathematical function in there I like, but I've chosen one which is basically z equals, and then it's 10 minus x cubed plus y minus 100 squared. Now note that the x here is $2, so that's C2, and then in the formula for this cell it will be D2, E2, F2 and so on. So I started off with putting the formula in there, and then I did a fill right and a fill right down. And if I for instance look at this cell, the x in that case is still C2, but the y is B12 and so on. So those z values are the values of a function, and what I'm now going to do is to draw a surface chart. So I need to select the cells, which obviously include all of my z values, but I also need the y values and the x values as well. So I'm going to make that selection, and then on the insert tab, many different options for that of course. I can use the little launcher in the corner, go to all charts, select surface chart, and I'm going to start with this first form. Click on OK, and I've got my surface chart. Now let me just make it a little bit bigger, a little bit easier to read. The axes aren't labelled, and I've actually got a legend here. The legend isn't really particularly going to help us at the moment, but let's not worry too much about that. But the main thing about a surface chart is this. There will tend to be a direction on a surface chart. It's a three-dimensional chart on a two-dimensional surface. You're showing it on your computer screen. And in this particular case, the main problem is that the whole thing is pointing in the wrong direction. You can't really make out any of the detail of the chart because we're looking at it from behind. Now one way of getting around that is if I go and select this axis, which is in effect the y-axis, so that's the one that goes from 0 to 100. If I right click, select format axis, one of the options is axis options series in reverse order. If I check that, and I'll just close this panel again, then I get a much better picture of this three-dimensional relationship between x, y and z. And of course, in order to achieve the effect that you want, you may need to do that on any of the three axes. So I've got the vertical axis here. I might want to go into format axis there, so I can scroll down and put the values in reverse order there as well, and then that is the effect that I achieve. And in any particular situation you'll want to choose the orientation of the axes that best suits your requirements. Another very important thing here, which is a fairly general issue with the use of surface charts, and another one of those things you need to be a little bit careful about, is that when we're dealing with numbers generated in this way, Excel has used its own logic to divide these Z values into categories, and it chooses an optimum number of categories. In this case there are 6 categories, and not only has it scaled that Z-axis accordingly, but it's assigned a color to each of the categories. Now if you want to change these colors, if you select a color using the legend here, then from that choice you can go in, you can change the color, you can change the fill, and so on. As usual, I'm not going to go through all that now. I assume you can go through and do those things. And similarly, on that Z-axis you could go in there and change the scaling, categorization, and so on. So you do need to adapt whatever Excel does to suit the message that you're trying to give. In this case, there really isn't a reason to categorize these Z values because we're really just plotting a function. But if I'd say been plotting temperature here against latitude and time of year, I may want to categorize the temperatures into hot, medium, moderate, cold, freezing, and so on, and maybe use blue for the cold ones and red for the hot ones. So there are lots of possibilities of how to make your surface chart give as much visual impression as possible. And finally on this, let's just look at the other types of surface chart, because there are 3 other types. If I go into surface chart again, one of the options is a 3D wireframe, and the 3D wireframe pretty much shows the same information, but it's a wireframe, it's effectively transparent, and sometimes that gives a very good impression as well. We also have what are called contour charts, and what contour charts are sort of 2D views of a surface chart. So let's do this 2D contour chart here, and this is effectively like looking down on the surface chart. It can be very useful for things like showing temperature distributions, that kind of thing. And then along with the 2D contour chart, again, the final type we've got in here is the wireframe contour. So again, effectively the same thing, but in this case with a wireframe, so it's effectively transparent, and you've just got the wireframing there. And obviously you can adapt this by selecting the legends at the bottom in terms of changing the color scheme and so on. So that's it on surface charts for now. Please join me in the next section.